We often say, if you have a clear conscience, you won't fear ghosts knocking at your door. While this saying holds true, in reality, we often use it as a psychological crutch to bolster our courage or to comfort ourselves in moments of fear. Looking back on the many cases I've encountered, most involve an inexplicable connection between the individuals involved in supernatural events. However, there are also many instances where people who had nothing to do with such occurrences became entangled in unresolved mysteries left behind by others. In truth, the notion of having nothing to do with it is often just a surface-level perception. Beneath it all, there are always unseen intersections and hidden connections, and because of these entangled fates, I have repeatedly tried to resolve the seemingly unbreakable pain that lingers in these cases. Yet, every effort I make seems to end in disappointment. Miss Liu was one of my clients. The first time I met her was in a hospital. Her husband was by her bedside, taking care of her. The moment I saw her, I was taken aback. Her right forehead was covered with a massive bandage. One side of her hair had been shaved off, and her head was wrapped in a thin, mesh-like protective covering. There was a bruise at the corner of her eye, and faint suture marks were visible on her lips. Had I not spoken to her on the phone beforehand, I might have assumed she was a victim of domestic violence or had bravely fought off an attacker in a dark alley, only to end up injured. She had learned about me through a friend, a woman I had once pursued but who had rejected me without hesitation due to my profession, despite my good looks. After that, we never kept in touch until now. However, it wasn't she who reached out to me directly. Instead, she passed my contact information to Miss Liu after the latter encountered some trouble. Miss Liu worked as an administrative assistant at a real estate company, regularly dealing with high-level executives. Technically, she could be considered a white-collar worker. Her husband, on the other hand, was in the paint business and made a considerable amount of money. From a practical standpoint, her job was more of a way to pass the time rather than a necessity. When she called me, she introduced herself as a close friend of my former acquaintance, which immediately discouraged me from quoting a high price for my services. She explained that the strange event she experienced was relatively minor compared to the bizarre cases I had dealt with in the past. Given that, I didn't overcharge her, and we quickly settled on a mutually agreeable fee before meeting in person, avoiding any potential awkwardness or disappointment later. Over the phone, she recounted the incident from that fateful night. She had worked late and returned home to find that her husband was not yet back. Assuming he was caught up with social obligations, she paid no mind and proceeded to take a bath. Unlike me, who prefers standing showers, she had a bathtub. Personally, I dislike bathing while lying down. It always makes me worry that I might accidentally fall asleep and drown. If that ever happened, the police would likely misinterpret my case as some sort of depraved homicide, and years later, when they finally solved it, my cause of death would be attributed to some deranged criminal. You know how it is? The dead can't defend themselves. Who would care whether I drowned or was murdered? My case might even be reopened years later as a prime example for forensic training. To commemorate my contribution to criminal investigation, they might even erect a statue in my honor and rename my residential complex after me. I have no interest in such posthumous fame, which is why I always take showers standing up. Of course, that doesn't eliminate the risk of slipping on soap, falling, and suffering memory loss. If that were to happen, I might wake up reflecting on life's unpredictability, write about my experience, and end up becoming a best-selling author. Apologies. Letting my imagination run wild is a bad habit of mine. Now, back to the story. That night, Miss Liu filled the tub with water and immersed herself, enjoying the soothing sensation. But then, she suddenly heard a bubbling noise. At first, she didn't pay much attention, assuming it was just air escaping from the pipes. She continued soaking for another 10 minutes, added some bath foam, and watched as bubbles surfaced. At that moment, she was reminded of those scenes in Hong Kong movies where women happily frolic in foamy baths. However, the bubbling sound grew more frequent. Upon closer listening, she realized it was coming from the drain at the bottom of the bathtub. Thinking she might not have secured the rubber stopper properly, she reached down to check. That's when things took a disturbing turn. The stopper she had personally placed was already pulled out. Strangely, though, the water wasn't draining rapidly, suggesting something was blocking it. She thought it might just be some loose hair and decided to clear it out with her fingers. The moment her fingertips brushed against something, she realized it wasn't just hair, it felt different. But she still assumed it was just strands that had gathered near the drain. So she continued pulling, determined to remove them. However, the harder she tugged, the more the bubbling intensified, and an odd resistance started pulling back. Then, to her horror, her fingers brushed against something fleshy. At first, she hesitated, but when she pressed it slightly, a wave of goosebumps erupted all over her body. It was thin, long, and unmistakably human, 3 fingers with disturbingly long nails. That was when she finally realized something was terribly wrong. Just as she tried to leap out of the bathtub, 2 cold, clammy hands grabbed her inner thighs, pinning her in place. She screamed, but there was no one home to hear her. At that moment, something dark and hairy began to surface from beneath the water. Due to the thick layer of foam, she couldn't see it clearly, but it looked like a mop head, or worse, a human head. Overwhelmed with terror, she lost all sense of composure. In a desperate fit of hysteria, she lashed out with everything within reach, flinging objects at the dark figure. At the same time, she kicked and struggled with all her might. Finally, as a bar of Lux soap flew through the air and struck the figure, the pressure holding her legs down suddenly vanished. Seizing the moment, she sprung out of the tub like a fish flipping out of water. But she had forgotten one crucial detail. Her body was still covered in slippery bath foam. As soon as she landed, she slipped and fell hard. In the process, her head smacked against the sink and she lost consciousness. It wasn't until her husband came home, saw the scene, and frantically shook her awake that she was rushed to the hospital. To be honest, Miss Liu had a naturally humorous way of recounting the incident, making it hard for me to keep a straight face while she spoke. However, given the distress she was going through, I held back my laughter. It would have been inappropriate to joke about it at that moment. After hanging up the phone, I replayed the events in my mind and analyzed the possible explanations. 3 possibilities came to mind. First, the apartment might have a tragic history. Perhaps someone had died there before. Second, the bathtub itself could be hiding a sinister secret. Given how some criminals dispose of bodies, there was a remote possibility that human remains had been embedded in the porcelain structure of the tub. Of course, that sounded like something straight out of a horror movie, so I deemed it unlikely. Third, the issue might be related to the water source. Perhaps, in some unknown location, a water-related death had occurred, leading to supernatural disturbances. Although I offered to visit Miss Liu at the hospital and help analyze the situation, my primary intention was to discuss the case with her in person and conduct a more thorough investigation. When I spoke face-to-face with Miss Liu at the hospital, we delved deeper into the issue. First, I ruled out the possibility that the house was haunted, and it was also unlikely that the bathtub was being used to dispose of a body. So, I began to suspect that the problem lay with the water supply. I questioned Miss Liu's husband since he had purchased the house a few years ago. He told me that the residential complex's water source came from a nearby reservoir, which was purified before being distributed to each household. Drownings in the reservoir were not uncommon, but since the entire building shared the same main water pipe, if there were any supernatural disturbances, they would likely affect the whole building, not just their home. As for whether I had the ability to dig 3 feet underground to inspect the main water pipe, clearly I did not. That led me to shift my suspicions elsewhere. I asked Miss Liu's husband whether any close relatives had passed away recently. He said no. His family, who lived in Zhejiang, were all in good health. Then I inquired whether they had recently brought any second-hand or unknown origin items into their home. Over the years, I had encountered many cases where people, either out of ignorance or to follow trends, unknowingly brought wandering spirits into their homes by purchasing objects with unknown histories. After some thought, he mentioned that a friend had recently brought them a thenka from Tibet, but wasn't sure if it counted. I shook my head slightly. This was unlikely to be the issue. Tibetan Buddhism is vast and profound, and Thenkas, being an essential part of it, are more likely to ward off evil than attract ghosts. So, I ruled that possibility out as well. Next, I suggested that Miss Liu and her husband give me their house keys and address so I could personally investigate. They hesitated. It wasn't easy for them to let their guard down completely. To ease their concerns, I left my ID and car keys at the hospital as collateral. Since Miss Liu needed her husband's care and company, I decided to go alone so as not to take up their time. If I was lucky, by the time Miss Liu was discharged, everything at home would be back to normal. Seeing me leave my ID and car keys as a guarantee, her husband seemed a little guilty. Whether or not I was getting paid, at the very least, my intentions were to help. In the end, he decided to give me their house keys and provided their address. They lived in Yubei District, where there was a reservoir. I was somewhat familiar with the area, and I could imagine that their household water supply likely came from there. The residential complex was large, with a significant scale, and a few years ago, the housing prices weren't cheap. The fact that they could afford such a home indicated that Miss Liu's husband was doing quite well in business. Their apartment was on a high floor. As soon as I stepped inside, I could tell that the interior design was meticulous and tasteful. It was clear they had put a lot of thought into the renovation. Earlier, Miss Liu's husband had somewhat sheepishly asked me not to enter their bedroom, saying it was messy. Taking the opportunity, I quietly pushed open the bedroom door. As expected, the room was a bit untidy. A wedding photo hung on the wall. The couple in the picture looked almost the same as they did now, suggesting they hadn't been married for long. I then walked into the bathroom. The bathtub was already drained, seemingly unremarkable. But there was a pool of blood on the floor, surrounded by shattered objects that Miss Liu had broken in anger. The place looked like a battlefield. Returning to the living room, I used my compass to scan every spot I suspected might be abnormal, but everything seemed normal until I stepped back into the bathroom. A sudden, intense reaction surged through me. The energy didn't feel aggressive, but rather like a warning, signaling me to stay away, or else the consequences would be unimaginable. At that moment, I realized just how naive I had been, treating the situation with a casual attitude. My heart pounded, and I instinctively stepped back from the bathroom. Retreating to the living room, I glanced back and saw my compass spinning wildly. A chill crept up my spine. I had been completely wrong. There was definitely a ghost here. And not just any ghost, this one was powerful. I replayed everything that had happened in the bathroom. The compass had reacted most violently near the bathtub. Could my earlier suspicion that a body had been dismembered and disposed of in the tub actually be true? If so, why hadn't the ghost directly harmed Miss Liu? Why did it choose to warn me instead? This ghost had the power to throw me out of the high-rise window like a piece of paper caught in the wind, leaving me to plummet helplessly to the ground, shattering into an unrecognizable mess. But it hadn't. It had only issued a warning. Determined to contain whatever was inside, I stretched red threads across both sides of the hallway leading to the bathroom, hoping to trap the spirit within and prevent it from escaping. Then, I sat on the living room sofa, eyes locked on the bathroom door, waiting in tense anticipation. At the same time, my mind was racing. I called some friends who were experienced in these matters. Most of their analyses aligned with my initial 3 theories. However, one young woman offered a different perspective. She suggested that I shouldn't act too hastily. Instead, I should take a gentler approach and try to communicate to make the ghost feel that I was there to help, not harm. Her delicate insight put me to shame. Heading to the kitchen, I gathered a few useful items, mainly spices and seasonings. Before they are spices, these are medicinal herbs, some of which can soothe restless spirits. I poured them into a bowl and added a handful of millet from my pocket, mixing them together until the bowl was half full. Holding my compass in my left hand, I balanced the bowl on top of it, careful not to block the needle. With a deep breath, I stepped over the red thread barrier and approached the bathroom door. As I scattered the mixture while chanting, I felt my tongue nearly tie itself in knots. The phrase Shun Qi Guan Quan Dao Hun Guisan Kaizhen was one my master had taught me when I first started learning. I wouldn't admit that it helped bolster my courage, nor would I say that it conveyed an important message to the spirit. I am not afraid of you. As the surrounding atmosphere gradually quieted down, I finally set the bowl down on the compass. Then, holding the bowl carefully, I approached the bathtub. Observing closely, I noticed that the strongest reaction occurred at the drain, just as Miss Liu had previously mentioned. This led me to conclude that the issue stemmed from the bathtub, though not the entire tub, which ruled out my second hypothesis. According to Miss Liu's description, the hair, fingers, and later, the 2 hands and a human head had all emerged from the drain. Could it be that something was hidden beneath it? Was this the key to the haunting? With these thoughts in mind, I reached out, inserted the rubber stopper, and turned on the water valve, filling the bathtub. Water has a certain suppressive effect on ghosts, unless their fate in life was somehow tied to water. This might explain why Miss Liu had not been harmed by the ghost in the bathtub. When the water level reached 2/3, I shut off the source, took a deep breath, and then pulled out the rubber stopper, slipping my fingers into the drain to explore. The pipe was L-shaped with a bend, making it difficult to feel anything. Just then, I distinctly felt a sharp sting at my fingertips, like being bitten by a small insect. The pain wasn't unbearable, but the sensitivity of my fingers made it impossible to ignore. More unsettling was that I definitely touched strands of hair and something soft and fleshy. It felt like human flesh. In that instant, a horrifying image flashed through my mind, a ghost extending its fingers, entwining them with mine. As the water in the tub rapidly drained away, fear crept in. What if something crawled out once the last drop was gone? I immediately let go, waiting for the final bit of water to gurgle down. If I could physically touch something to drain, then there had to be a secret hidden there. Mustering my courage, I stood up, walked into the living room, grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, and returned to the bathtub. Aiming at the drain, I swung down hard. The moment the hammer struck the bathtub, an overwhelming pressure surged toward me. It felt as if my cheeks and neck were being forcibly tightened. Not like being strangled, but more like the sensation of skin shrinking under the rapid drying of water after swimming in a scorching wind. I immediately realized that this oppressive force came from the ghost, desperately trying to stop me from breaking the bathtub. But I knew I had to endure it. Ignoring the invisible resistance, I swung the hammer again and again, like a warrior determined to shatter the legendary Simagong jar. Only when a massive crack split the drain open did I finally stop. Dropping the hammer, I grabbed a bar of soap from the floor, smeared it with some water splashed onto the tiles, and without hesitation, scrawled a charm onto the bathtub wall. To be honest, this charm wasn't something my master had taught me. It was a trick I secretly learned from an unreliable friend. It was a rather aggressive method, forcibly suppressing the spirit within the bathtub to prevent it from acting maliciously. This wasn't my usual approach, but given the circumstances, I had no choice. Smashing the bathtub had drained my strength completely. Frankly, I was so exhausted that I probably couldn't even win a fight against a bunch of red, scarf-wearing young pioneers. After catching my breath, I bent down to examine the hole I had created. The bathtub looked expensive. I silently hoped Miss Liu wouldn't make me compensate for the damage. Using a discarded toothbrush head Miss Liu had carelessly left around, I nudged away the broken ceramic pieces and discovered a mesh filter hidden behind the crack, clogged with hair and grime. Beneath the shattered tiles, I also uncovered something that absolutely should not have been there. Thinking back to all the details I had observed since entering the apartment, combined with my deductions, a realization suddenly struck me. I stepped out of the protective circle I had set up, returned to the living room, and sat down in deep thought. After a long contemplation, I finally decided I needed to make a phone call. From within the bathtub drain, I had retrieved a ring. The platinum band itself was unremarkable, but what stood out was the roughly 0.6 carat diamond set upon it, gleaming with undeniable brilliance. Holding it in my hand, I felt its hefty weight. Despite prolonged exposure to chemical bath products, the ring had not discolored, only slightly worn from time. The diamond, however, remained as dazzling as ever. At that moment, I felt conflicted. Sitting on the couch, I hesitated. My mind spun with a dilemma. Should I pretend I had never seen the ring and quietly pocket it, or should I return it to Miss Liu's family? Given the recent rise in precious metal prices, this ring was undoubtedly valuable. If I sold it, I could fetch a good sum. Examining it more closely, I noticed an engraving inside the band. In addition to the platinum PT marking, there was a line of tiny letters, "Dear May." My English wasn't great, but I could tell that it likely meant the ring was dedicated to someone named May. Judging by its design and size, it was undoubtedly a woman's ring. Since I had found it inside the bathtub drain, it was unlikely to belong to a factory worker who installed the tub, meaning it must have belonged to someone in Miss Liu's family. However, there was something strange. Miss Liu's name contained no trace of May. Could it be a fashionable English nickname she used? Or was the ring completely unrelated to her? If I returned it, I might resolve the ghostly disturbance, but I could also inadvertently stir up a family dispute. After careful consideration, I decided I couldn't keep something that didn't belong to me. In the end, I picked up my phone and dialed Miss Liu's number. Once the call connected, I made an excuse that she was unable to talk and asked her to pass the phone to her husband, Mr. Hu. I told Mr. Hu to find a quiet place before continuing the conversation. Once he moved, presumably to the hallway, I got straight to the point. "How long have you been with Miss Liu?" "About 3 years," he replied. "When did you buy your house?" I pressed on. 5 years ago, back when housing prices weren't as outrageous as they are now," he said. As he spoke, a few clues began to take shape in my mind, though I wasn't entirely sure if I was on the right track. I continued, "I have a rather personal question. Before Miss Liu, did you ever have a girlfriend? And did you ever give her a diamond ring?" As soon as I asked, I knew that if I had any intention of claiming that ring, it was almost certainly out of the question. Mr. Hu fell silent for a moment. I could vaguely hear footsteps on the other end, suggesting he was moving to a more private location. After a brief pause, he finally spoke. "Yes, I had a girlfriend. We were together for 5 years. But how do you know that?" I chuckled. "Answer my questions first, and then I'll tell you." Then I asked, "What was your ex-girlfriend's name?" "Her name was Mimi," he replied. I figured the name May might have been a phonetic translation of May. I wanted to learn more about her. But Mr. Hu told me that ever since their breakup, they had completely lost contact. He had no idea where she was or how she was doing. At that moment, my heart sank. I suddenly realized Mr. Hu didn't know that Mimi was no longer alive. I cautiously pressed on, continuing to probe for details. When I asked about the reason for their breakup, a trace of unresolved confusion flickered in Mr. Hu's eyes. He admitted that, to this day, he still didn't understand why Mimi had chosen to leave him. He recalled that when they first met, Mimi was still a university student, while he had already graduated and was working in Chongqing. At the time, he was struggling financially after quitting his job, barely making ends meet. Mimi's parents were high-ranking officials, and her family was well off. From the beginning, they disapproved of their relationship. But over time, Mr. Hu leveraged his entrepreneurial instincts, starting with selling toothpicks and gradually expanding his business. As his financial situation improved, he found himself spending less and less time with Mimi. Feeling guilty, he decided to invest his savings into buying their current home, hoping to build a future together. The apartment was meant to be their marital home. Mr. Hu sighed deeply, as if the conversation had reopened an old wound. Nevertheless, he realized I had my reasons for asking, so he continued. He admitted their relationship had been challenging. First, Mimi's parents disapproved because he was from Zhejiang, too far from Chongqing. They feared he might eventually take Mimi back to Zhejiang, meaning they'd rarely see their daughter again. Second, at the time, Mimi was still a bright-eyed, innocent university student, while Mr. Hu had already been navigating the real world for some time. Her parents worried she would be deceived. Though they eventually relented under Mimi's persistence, they still harbored reservations. When Mr. Hu first visited Mimi's home, he brought many gifts and used what little savings he had to invite her parents to a luxurious dinner in Chongqing, hoping to prove his sincerity. Over dinner, he solemnly promised to give their daughter a grand wedding. His gesture moved them, and they reluctantly agreed to let the relationship continue. As his business flourished, marriage became the next logical step. But despite his growing success, he felt his savings still fell short of the grand wedding he envisioned. Meanwhile, Mimi had turned 26. While not old, she had begun to feel a sense of urgency about getting married. Mr. Hu understood her feelings, even though she never directly voiced them. Wanting to ease her concerns, he bought her a ring, a token of his commitment, essentially an engagement ring. Mimi was overjoyed, convinced she had chosen the right man. They continued their steady relationship until one day, Mimi suggested they take a trip to Hong Kong together. But due to his business obligations, Mr. Hu couldn't go. He encouraged her to go alone and promised to take her another time. Though slightly disappointed, Mimi still went by herself. When she returned, everything changed. She was no longer the gentle, understanding woman he knew. She became irritable and moody. They had never argued before, but suddenly, even minor issues sparked intense fights. At first, Mr. Hu thought he had done something wrong and reflected on his actions, but the situation only worsened. Mimi became increasingly erratic and difficult to understand. Arguments became routine. He tried multiple times to talk things through, hoping to find the root of the problem. But each time, she either avoided the topic or spoke in incoherent fragments, which only escalated their conflicts. During that period, he was completely drained, utterly lost. He couldn't understand how the woman he loved had transformed so drastically, all because of a single trip to Hong Kong. Mr. Hu sighed. Even when someone makes a mistake, they at least deserve to know what they did wrong. Why was I never given that chance? Mr. Hu continued, saying that as time went on, the two of them gradually fell into a state of emotional coldness. They became indifferent to each other, neither willing to engage. When they crossed paths, they might exchange a few casual words if they were in a good mood. But most of the time, they simply went about their own business in silence. Their relationship faded, and Mr. Hu's work began to suffer as well. The stress at home left him unable to focus, and his mood grew increasingly unsettled. One day, overwhelmed by frustration, he decided to go out drinking. He drank himself into a stupor and stumbled home late at night, only to erupt into a heated argument with Xiao Mei. However, in his drunken haze, he could only vaguely recall one sentence she said, "This isn't going anywhere. We should just end it." The next morning, as he replayed her words in his mind, a wave of heartache washed over him. Determined to salvage their crumbling relationship, he reached for Xiao Mei's hand, hoping to make one last effort. But as he grasped her fingers, he suddenly realized that the ring he had given her, the one she had never taken off, was gone. A surge of anger overtook him. He demanded to know where the ring was. "I threw it away," Xiao Mei replied coldly. "Why?" he pressed. "Because I don't love you anymore," she answered flatly. It was only natural to get rid of it. At that moment, Mr. Hu felt utterly devastated, as if he had reached the end of love itself. Powerless, he let go of her hand. Xiao Mei, however, remained emotionless. "You were drunk last night," she said. "I've already packed my things. I'm leaving today. There's nothing left between us. Don't try to find me. And if you dare go to my parents, I swear I'll hate you for life. I'll make you regret it." Hearing those cruel words, Mr. Hu felt his heart shatter completely. He was broken, but he wasn't willing to beg. He didn't stop her from leaving. Xiao Mei walked away, leaving behind only unanswered questions and unbearable pain. Though Mr. Hu had his pride and never sought her out again, he tormented himself in the days that followed. The love that had once seen him through difficult times had vanished without explanation. Day after day, he found himself wandering near Xiao Mei's parents' home, tempted to storm inside and demand the truth. But each time he stopped himself. Their breakup had been so absolute, he didn't want to push her past her final limit. One day, someone told him that the best way to move on from a past relationship was to start a new one. With that thought in mind, he met Miss Liu, Mr. who admitted that he was a rational person when it came to relationships. He wouldn't let his new partner live in the shadow of his past, so he devoted himself entirely to Miss Liu, and eventually they built a life together. Yet even as he tried his best to love Miss Liu, he couldn't deny that deep inside, he still reserved the warmest corner of his heart for Xiaomei. He kept the memory of their once beautiful love locked away, a piece of the past he refused to let go. After hearing Mr. Hu's story, I found myself at a loss for words. I wouldn't consider myself particularly wise when it comes to love, and I had no way of untangling their past. It was all history now. One had settled down and built a new life. The other had disappeared forever, lost in the divide between life and death. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was an inevitable connection between Xiaomei's departure and her passing. After all, how else could I explain it? She went on a trip to Hong Kong, and when she returned, she was like a completely different person. If there was an unspeakable secret behind her leaving, or if she had already sensed that her life was nearing its end, then maybe her strange behavior finally made sense. I hesitated to voice my suspicion, but I knew I had to let Mr. Hu process everything first. Then, when the time was right, I would tell him the possibility that had formed in my mind. Xiaomei perhaps had already left this world long ago. Mr. Hu was momentarily stunned upon hearing those words. His emotions surged violently, his eyes brimming with an uncontrollable intensity. In that instant, it was as if he could never escape the warm yet fragile corner of his heart that he had reserved for Xiaomei. To him, that place was sacred, so sacred that any intrusion was utterly intolerable, for it guarded his deepest emotions. His voice trembled with shock and anger, almost as if he were on the verge of tears. He questioned me in a quivering voice, demanding to know why I would say such things. Even after all these years, he remained entangled in that profound emotional turmoil. So, I told him the truth. I revealed everything I had done in his home, even admitting that I had smashed his bathtub and discovered the ring. My tone was heavy with meaning as I hinted that the ring might have been something Xiaomei had hidden before she passed away. Perhaps she had concealed it in the bathtub drain long ago, and now the strange hauntings tied to the bathtub were undoubtedly connected to it. Piecing everything together, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that Xiaomei was no longer in this world. I told Mr. Hu that some things must be let go, no matter how difficult it may be. He had a family now and needed to understand where to draw the line. He fell silent on the other end of the phone, his sobs gradually subsiding. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but filled with deep regret. He apologized, acknowledging his loss of control and saying that he understood me. I asked for the address of Xiaomei's parents, expressing my desire to visit them in person. He agreed and urged me to tell him the truth once I learned it, as it was just as important to him. I reassured him, telling him to take good care of Miss Liu, as she was now the most important person in his life. He promised he would. After hanging up, I tidied up the bathroom and did my best to contain the lingering presence of Xiaomei's spirit in the bathtub. Then, following the address Mr. Hu had given me, I set out for Xiaomei's home. Her family lived in a mid-range residential area in the Nan'an district, which matched their status as government officials. They lived quietly, avoiding unnecessary attention. On the way there, I carefully planned out a few different approaches for our conversation, preparing various strategies in my mind. When I knocked on the door, I was greeted by an elderly man wearing a beige vest. He had reading glasses perched on his nose, and his balding head had only a few strands of hair swaying in the breeze. Summoning my courage, I told him that I was a college classmate of Xiaomei and had only recently learned about her situation, so I had come to visit. I deliberately kept my words vague because I wasn't entirely certain whether Xiaomei was deceased. If she had passed away, the elderly man would likely show sadness and gratitude. If she were still alive, he might simply think I had come to see an old friend. But if she was still living, I would have to continue investigating the mysterious object in the bathtub, which meant a significant increase in my workload. I was starting to regret not keeping that ring for myself. Sure enough, a flash of sorrow and appreciation crossed the old man's eyes. He invited me inside and led me straight to a small altar. On it sat a black and white memorial portrait of a beautiful woman. I assumed this was Xiaomei. The old man handed me 3 incense sticks and lit them before turning to the portrait and saying, "Daughter, your old classmate has come to see you." At that moment, I felt a twinge of awkwardness. I didn't actually know Xiaomei, and this lie felt particularly uncomfortable. But I still offered the incense with sincerity, silently assuring her in my heart, "Don't worry, I will help you find peace." After the incense burned, I sat beside Xiaomei's father on the couch, my mind filled with questions. I was eager to learn what had really happened to her. He let out a heavy sigh before slowly recounting the heartbreaking story. A few years ago, Xiaomei traveled alone to Hong Kong. During her trip, she suddenly felt unwell and went to the hospital for a checkup. The diagnosis was devastating late-stage uterine cancer. At such a young age, she couldn't bear the weight of this news. She was terrified to tell Mr. Hu, so she abruptly left Hong Kong and returned home to her parents. At first, she didn't say anything, but soon after, she moved out of Mr. Hu's home and told her parents that they had broken up. She also warned them not to contact Mr. Hu, threatening to sever ties with them if they interfered. Though her parents didn't understand the real reason, they had always doted on her, so they didn't press the issue and simply respected her wishes. A year later, her condition worsened. She could no longer hide the truth, and her parents finally noticed something was wrong. When they confronted her, she admitted that she was gravely ill. But by then, it was already too late. Her parents wanted to reach out to Mr. Hu, but she adamantly refused. She had learned from friends that Mr. Hu had a new girlfriend and was planning to get married. Perhaps she saw this as her farewell to their past relationship. In her own way, she chose to love him silently. Tears welled up in the old man's eyes. I've always been the type to stay emotionally detached when listening to other stories, viewing them as an outsider. But at that moment, I could feel the depth of his pain. He continued, explaining that Xiaomei eventually passed away. He had once lamented how tragic it was for elderly parents to bury their children, but never imagined that this heartbreak would become his own reality. Xiaomei was their only child. They were already too old to have another, nor had they ever considered adoption. To them, Xiaomei was irreplaceable, their entire world. I hesitated before asking, "Did Xiaomei ever mention any unfulfilled wishes?" He was silent for a moment before replying in a low voice. She said she had no particular regrets, except that she never got to marry Mr. Hu, never had a child with him, and never got the chance to care for us in our old age. At this, he fell back into sorrow. I knew that no words could bring him comfort. After all, I was here under false pretenses, playing the role of a classmate. Seeing his deep grief, I realized I shouldn't push any further. So, I simply sat with him for a while before quietly taking my leave. On the way back, I couldn't help but reflect on how unpredictable life could be. I also reviewed the entire situation in my mind. From what I had gathered, Xiaomei, upon learning her illness was terminal, made the heartbreaking decision to forgo treatment. She knew that if she told her family or Mr. Hu, they would stop at nothing to save her. But that would only burden them, wasting time, money, and causing unnecessary suffering. The outcome would not change, so she chose to spare them from prolonged pain. However, as her condition worsened, she knew the truth would inevitably surface. So she made a difficult choice to break up with Mr. Hu, spend her final days with her parents, and protect him from heartbreak. The engagement ring was a token of their love. She knew it would always belong to her, yet she could never take it with her. To keep it safe from theft, she hid it in the bathtub drain. Though she had been cold and harsh toward Mr. Hu, I believed that her pain must have been 100 times greater than his. I pulled out my phone and looked up information on uterine cancer. It was one of the leading causes of death among women, and once it reached the late stage, treatment became incredibly difficult. The famous singer Anita Mui had also succumbed to this disease. I silently prayed that all women would take care of their health and get regular checkups. After all, health was the most important thing. A single illness could take away more than just a life. It could destroy families and drain everything they had. Finally, I called Mr. Hu. I told him everything I had learned and promised that I would personally go to his home and help Xiaomei's soul find peace. This was not just a promise to her, it was also the only way to help her finally let go. Mr. Hu promised me that once Miss Liu recovered, he would confess everything to her. He would take her to Xiaomei's home and her grave to pay respects, telling her that he had found a lifelong partner and would live happily ever after. By the time we returned to Mr. Hu's house, night had fallen. Before I could begin the ritual to help Xiaomei's soul find peace, I made sure to call a Buddhist friend to teach me a prayer for the deceased. Whether I believe in Buddhism or not, such a beautiful woman deserved this ceremony, to rest in peace on the other side. During this time, Xiaomei appeared unusually calm. Perhaps it was the incense I had lit for her at her house earlier. She seemed to sense my goodwill. I then spoke openly to her, telling her that Mr. Hu knew everything now and hoping she wouldn't blame me. I also told her that Mr. Hu would receive the love and care of everyone, including the care meant for her beloved. I reassured her that she needed to move on to her own future, toward the light, and not to look back. Just as I was about to take her away, I felt an odd sensation in my jaw and neck. This time, it wasn't the previous tightness, but something warm and gentle. I couldn't help but narcissistically wonder, maybe my good looks had made Xiaomei fall for me, and she couldn't resist hugging me tightly. Afterward, I took on the role of a servant, carefully fixing the bathtub I had accidentally broken with transparent tape. It seemed so trivial, but I understood that when you break something belonging to someone else, you have to make up for it. You can't ignore the importance of face. That evening, I visited the hospital again, telling Miss Liu that everything had been resolved. She trusted me completely, as it was I who introduced her to a friend of ours. She promised that once she was discharged, she would treat me to a meal and settle the payment for this matter. Before leaving, I called Mr. Hu out into the hallway, planning to say something, but not sure how to start. I had heard many stories about love, and while theirs wasn't the most touching, it made me believe in the power of love. In the end, he spoke first. He said, "Brother, no matter what, I really want to thank you. I'm a businessman, and maybe all the years in the business world, plus the emotional wounds I've suffered, have made me numb. But with Xiaomei, when you were busy outside, I kept asking myself, what place does she have in my heart? After thinking it over for a long time, I have my answer. I do love her. She lied to me, but it was out of good intentions. However, forgiving her, I don't know if I can do that. She did this because she was afraid I couldn't handle it, but I could. If she is really going to die tomorrow, then tonight I would marry her. I'm that kind of person. When I love wholeheartedly, and when I hate with all my heart. I'd rather cry and suffer than stay indifferent. So I can't forgive her for hiding her illness from me, even though I've married Xiao Lu. Don't worry, after she recovers, I'll tell her everything. Xiao Lu is outgoing, like a boy, and I believe she will understand. I looked at him and said, "You're lucky. You had a woman who once loved you. Take care of Miss Liu. I need to go back to my own love." So the two men stood in silence in the hallway for a long time until I reached out and took his hand, placing the ring in his palm. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in my videos, please subscribe to my channel. See you next time.